Imagine a conflict so vast it stretched across more than 100 years, touching generations and reshaping the very idea of what it meant to be a nation. We think we know the story of the 100 Years' War, the epic clashes, the heroic stands, the legendary figures like Joan of Arc and the Black Prince. But what if I told you that some of the most decisive moments in this prolonged struggle aren't found in the pages of your typical history book? They weren't always loud, dramatic battles fought under fluttering banners. Sometimes they were quiet, almost invisible shifts, a treaty signed in a dimly lit chamber, a plague that silently emptied towns and crippled armies, a marriage meant to unite kingdoms that instead deepened divisions. This war between England and France was never just about crowns and conquests. It was a living, breathing organism of political intrigue, economic innovation, social upheaval, and cultural transformation. Behind the famous names and storied battlefields lies a richer, more complex narrative, one filled with turning points so subtle, so easily overlooked, that we've often missed just how much they dictated the flow of history. These are the moments when the tide turned not with a roar, but with a whisper, the decisions made in uncertainty, the crises that forced adaptation, the human stories of cunning, survival, and resilience that textbook summaries rarely capture. In this video, we're setting out on a journey to uncover 20 of these hidden pivot points, events that quietly altered the destiny of medieval Europe and whose echoes can still be felt today. We'll explore how a papal schism divided loyalties beyond religion, how peasant revolts shook the foundations of French society, and how innovations in taxation and military organization laid the groundwork for the modern state. This isn't just a recounting of facts, it's an invitation to see history through a wider lens, to appreciate the delicate interplay of cause and effect that defines our world. So settle in and prepare to look beyond the obvious, because the real story of the 100 Years' War is far more fascinating than you ever imagined. To truly grasp the significance of the turning points we're about to explore, we first need to step back and see the entire chessboard. The conflict we call the 100 Years' War was not a single, continuous war, but a series of separate wars, periods of tense truce, and sporadic campaigns that stretched across 116 years. It began in 1337 and did not truly conclude until the French finally expelled the English from their soil in 1453 with the fall of Bordeaux. The roots of this immense struggle were tangled and deep, far more complex than a simple story of English kings wanting the French crown. It was a combustible mix of dynastic ambition, feudal law, and raw economic competition. For centuries, the English monarchy had held vast and wealthy territories in France, particularly in the southwest region of Aquitaine. As French kings grew more powerful, they sought to consolidate their authority and viewed these English-held lands as a threat to their realm. The final spark, however, was a crisis of succession. When Charles IV of France died in 1328 without a direct male heir, his closest relative was his nephew, King Edward III of England. The French nobility, unwilling to accept an English king, invoked an old legal precedent to pass over Edward and crown Philip VI of Valois. This snub created a permanent, festering grievance for the English crown, a dynastic insult that would be used to justify over a century of warfare. But this was never just about a crown or a legal claim. It was about money and power. The economies of England and France were inextricably linked yet fiercely competitive. England's wealth was built on wool, much of which was woven into cloth in the cities of Flanders, a region that was technically a fiefdom of the French king. This created a tense and awkward triangle of dependency. Furthermore, control of the vital sea lanes of the English Channel was crucial for trade and for the movement of armies. Any shift in this delicate balance could trigger a new round of hostilities. The nature of warfare itself was also undergoing a radical transformation during this period. The English, in particular, perfected the use of the longbow, a weapon so devastating it could pierce armor and decimate a charging French knightly cavalry from a safe distance. This technological edge allowed smaller English armies to win stunning victories against much larger French forces at battles like Crécy and Poitiers. Later in the war, the development of gunpowder artillery began to change the very nature of sieges, making old stone castles vulnerable for the first time. War was becoming more professional, more brutal, and far more expensive. And then, an unforeseen catastrophe struck that would dwarf the horrors of battle. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe, sweeping across the continent and wiping out as much as half of the population in some regions. This wasn't just a demographic tragedy, it was a seismic event that shattered the medieval world's social and economic foundations. The massive loss of life created severe labor shortages, driving up the cost of soldiers and supplies and making it incredibly difficult for either side to raise and maintain large armies for extended campaigns. The plague forced kings and commanders to adapt, leading to a greater reliance on swift, destructive raids known as chevauchées, designed to terrorize the population and cripple the enemy's economy rather than to conquer territory. Politically, the map of Europe was a shifting puzzle of alliances and betrayals. The powerful Duchy of Burgundy, for instance, often acted as a state within a state, sometimes allying with England against the French king to further its own territorial ambitions. This internal division within France was at times a greater threat to the Valois monarchy than the English invaders. Meanwhile, both kingdoms were strained by internal pressures. Peasant revolts like the Jacquerie in France and financial crises that forced kings to beg for money from their parliaments tested the stability and resilience of both nations. It is against this backdrop of dynastic quarrel, economic rivalry, technological change, and social upheaval that our story unfolds. Only by understanding this complex, volatile landscape can we begin to see how a single event in a remote duchy or a decision made in a distant papal court could quietly alter the course of history. Now consider the first of our overlooked turning points, a conflict within a conflict that historians often relegate to the footnotes, the Breton War of Succession. On the surface, it appears to be a classic medieval drama. A distant duke dies without a clear heir, and two rival claimants emerge to fight for his title. But to dismiss this 23-year struggle for the Duchy of Brittany as a mere regional squabble is to miss its profound significance. In reality, it became the first major proxy war of the 100 Years' conflict, a deadly testing ground where England and France could fight one another by supporting rival factions, all while maintaining a thin veneer of deniability. The two main contenders could not have been more perfectly aligned to draw in the great powers. On one side stood Charles of Blois, the nephew of the French king, Philip VI. His claim was championed by the Valois monarchy, which saw an opportunity to bring the traditionally independent-minded Duchy of Brittany firmly under the French crown's control. Opposing him was John of Montfort, a half-brother of the deceased duke, who understood that his claim was weaker in the eyes of French law. Knowing he needed a powerful patron, he immediately sailed to England and pledged homage to King Edward III. Edward, ever eager to find new fronts to pressure France, enthusiastically provided men, money, and military support. Just like that, a local dispute was transformed into an international crisis. For over 2 decades, this war drained the resources and attention of both England and France. Precious funds that could have been spent on grand campaigns in Normandy or Gascony were instead funneled into the Breton theatre to pay for soldiers, siege engines, and bribes for the local nobility. The loyalty of these Breton lords became a currency in itself, constantly tested and traded. A noble's castle might fly the French fleur de lis 1 month and the English lions the next, depending on who offered the better terms or posed the more immediate threat. This ever-shifting landscape of allegiances provided a masterclass in the messy, pragmatic realities of medieval warfare, far from the idealized notions of chivalry. The fighting also served as a brutal laboratory for military tactics. The Battle of Oray in 1364 was a particularly decisive moment. Here, an English army under Sir John Chandos, fighting for the Montfortist cause, employed now familiar tactics against a larger French force supporting Charles of Blois. They chose a strong defensive position, dismounted their men-at-arms, and unleashed the devastating power of the English longbow. The result was a crushing victory that ended the war. Charles of Blois was killed in the fighting, and John of Montfort's son was confirmed as Duke of Brittany. The lesson was clear to all observers. English methods, when applied correctly, could defeat numerical superiority. This proof of concept at Oray would directly influence strategies in the larger war for decades to come. Furthermore, the Breton conflict underscored a strategic truth that would echo throughout the entire Hundred Years' War: the absolute necessity of naval power. Brittany's long coastline made it a perfect base for controlling the English Channel. From Breton ports, English ships could raid French supply lines and protect their own vessels carrying troops and wool to the continent. The French, meanwhile, sought to blockade these same ports to strangle the English war effort. Control of the sea lanes was not a secondary concern. It was often the decisive factor in whether a campaign could be launched or sustained at all. The war's resolution, the Treaty of Guérande, seemed to settle the matter in England's favor. John IV was recognized as Duke, and he owed his throne largely to English support. But in a twist that would become a recurring theme, this victory was not as clear-cut as it appeared. The new Duke of Brittany, while grateful, was also a pragmatic ruler. He had no intention of being a mere English puppet, and would spend much of his reign carefully balancing his obligations to England with the need to maintain peace with his powerful French neighbor. This created a semi-independent Brittany that remained a persistent strategic complication for the French crown, a neutral-ish zone that could never be fully trusted. The resources France was forced to commit to monitoring and managing this uneasy western frontier for the next 50 years were resources that could not be used to expel the English from elsewhere. A sideshow it was not. It was a first, crucial act that set the stage for everything that followed. While the staggering death toll of the Black Death is a well-known historical tragedy, its silent, systematic dismantling of military logistics is a story rarely told with the emphasis it deserves. The plague did not just kill people, it assassinated entire systems of supply and support, creating a logistical nightmare that would force a complete rethink of how medieval warfare was waged. Imagine the backbone of any army, not just the knights and archers, but the countless anonymous individuals who made their existence possible. The cartwrights who built the wagons, the blacksmiths who shod the horses and forged the arrows, the masons who repaired castle walls, the farmers who grew the food, and the teamsters who transported it all. In a matter of months, this vital supporting cast was decimated. Workshops fell silent, fields lay fallow, and supply chains that stretched across kingdoms simply snapped under the strain. This catastrophic loss of specialized labor had an immediate and paralyzing effect on military operations. Raising a traditional feudal army, a slow and cumbersome process at the best of times, became nearly impossible. Lords who could once summon a quota of men from their estates found those estates empty, the peasants dead or fled. The construction of siege engines, massive, complex machines like trebuchets that required highly skilled carpenters and engineers, ground to a halt. There simply weren't enough craftsmen left alive to build them. Even maintaining existing fortifications, the key to holding territory, became a desperate struggle. A castle with a gaping hole in its wall was suddenly a permanent vulnerability because the knowledge and manpower to repair it had vanished overnight. The shortages hit the fighting ranks with just as much force. The English longbow, that great equalizer of medieval battlefields, was a weapon of immense skill. Training a proficient longbowman took years, often starting in childhood to develop the required muscle memory and strength. The plague wiped out a generation of these archers, creating an expertise gap that could not be quickly filled. Experienced commanders and seasoned men at arms, the institutional knowledge of any army, also succumbed to the disease, leaving forces green, leaderless, and far less effective. Faced with this impossible reality, kings and generals had no choice but to call lengthy time-outs in the war. The years following the plague's arrival saw prolonged pauses in major campaigning, not out of desire for peace, but out of sheer logistical necessity. This vacuum of reliable national manpower had a dangerous side effect: the rapid rise of the mercenary. Kings, desperate to field any kind of army, turned to these professional, paid companies. While often highly skilled, these bands owed allegiance only to their paymaster and their own self-interest. When their contracts ended or their pay was delayed, they did not simply disband and go home. Instead, they became roaming bands of armed marauders, known as free companies or routiers, who would pillage the countryside to sustain themselves. This created a second, parallel war against a stateless enemy, further devastating regions already reeling from the plague and the official conflict. The countryside of France, in particular, was caught in a vicious cycle, terrorized by these freelance armies who destabilized the very territories their original employers were trying to control. Yet, from this period of forced inactivity and constraint emerged a crucible of military innovation. Commanders were pushed to develop strategies that required fewer men and less complex logistics. The answer was the chevauchée, a swift, brutal raid deep into enemy territory. The goal of a chevauchée was not to conquer and hold land, but to destroy it. By burning crops, sacking towns, and spreading terror, a relatively small, highly mobile force could cripple an enemy's economy and shatter their aura of authority, all without the need for a large, hard-to-supply army or a single set-piece battle. This shift in doctrine was direct adaptation to a post-plague world. It emphasized speed, mobility, and economic targeting over the slow, grinding warfare of sieges and grand maneuvers. The Black Death, in its terrible way, had forced a revolution in military thought, moving warfare away from the chivalric ideal of climactic battles and towards a more pragmatic and arguably more terrible form of total war aimed at breaking the will of a nation. Yet for all its grand promises, the Treaty of Brétigny was built on a foundation of sand. It was less a true peace and more a temporary ceasefire born of sheer exhaustion, and its terms contained the seeds of its own inevitable destruction. The core of the problem lay in a clever and ultimately disastrous legal fiction. The treaty was structured in two parts. First, a preliminary agreement where Edward III would renounce his claim to the French throne in exchange for an enlarged and sovereign Aquitaine, free from any feudal obligation to Paris. Second, a final peace treaty that would be ratified after all the territorial transfers were complete. This second part, crucially, was never finalized. This legal limbo meant that, in the eyes of many, Edward's renunciation was technically conditional. It gave both sides a permanent loophole, a reason to later declare the entire agreement null and void when it suited their purposes. The peace was stillborn, its most important element forever hanging in the air, unresolved. The practical task of transferring territories quickly devolved into a messy and contentious ordeal. The treaty called for the handover of a vast swath of western France to English control, but local commanders, nobles, and townships had their own loyalties and interests. In many areas, French officials were reluctant to leave, and English administrators struggled to assert their authority over an often hostile population. Key strategic locations, particularly the vital port city of Calais, became flashpoints of dispute. The transfer process was slow, incomplete, and fraught with accusations of bad faith from both sides. These lingering pockets of resistance and administrative chaos meant that a state of low-level, localized warfare never truly ceased. The border between English and French control remained a blurred and violent frontier, where raids, skirmishes, and sieges continued to simmer, constantly undermining the fragile spirit of the peace. Financially, the treaty placed a back-breaking burden on France while offering England a poisoned chalice of new wealth. The ransom for King John II was set at the astronomical sum of 3 million écus, a figure equivalent to twice the annual revenue of the French crown. To secure his release, the French had to make initial payments that drained the treasury and required the imposition of new, deeply unpopular taxes. This financial strain crippled the French economy for years, fueling social unrest and resentment against the monarchy. For England, the immediate influx of cash was a windfall, but it masked a deeper problem. The administration of their new continental empire was a logistical and political nightmare. Governing a large, culturally French territory required a delicate touch, something the English occupying forces often lacked. They imposed heavy taxes and favored English officials, fostering a deep-seated resentment among the local Aquitanian nobility and populace. These were not grateful new subjects. They were a conquered people waiting for an opportunity to revolt, their loyalty to the English crown paper thin at best. Perhaps the most significant and most overlooked consequence of the Bratigny interlude was the gift of time it gave to the French. For the young and intellectually gifted Charles, the Dauphin who had been forced to govern a kingdom in chaos, these 9 years of nominal peace were a priceless opportunity to rebuild. While the English basked in their short-term gains and struggled with governance, Charles V and his brilliant advisors, like the Constable Bertrand du Guesclin, embarked on a sweeping program of military and fiscal reform. They learned from the devastating defeats at Crécy and Poitiers. Instead of meeting the English head-on in pitched battles, they developed a new strategy of attrition, avoiding major engagements, harassing supply lines, and methodically recapturing fortified towns through careful sieges. He reorganized the army, creating a more professional, standing force. Most importantly, he overhauled the tax system, establishing a more reliable stream of revenue to fund this new model of warfare. The Treaty of Brétigny did not bring peace. It gave France the breathing room it desperately needed to invent a new way to fight, transforming itself from a defeated kingdom into a resilient, modern state capable of winning a war of reconquest. Just as the Treaty of Brétigny created a fragile peace on the ground, a seismic fracture in the very heart of Western Christendom would soon open a new front in the conflict, one fought not with swords, but with spiritual authority and international diplomacy. For nearly 40 years, from 1378 to 1417, the Catholic Church was not a single, unifying force but a divided institution with not one, but two and at one point 3 rival popes, each claiming to be the one true vicar of Christ. This period, known as the Great Western Schism, did more than just confuse the faithful. It weaponized faith itself, entangling religious allegiance with national interest in a way that profoundly complicated the already bitter war between England and France. The schism's origins were deeply political. For much of the 14th century, the papacy had resided not in Rome, but in the French city of Avignon, leading many to see it as a puppet of the French crown. When Pope Gregory XI finally returned to Rome and died shortly after, the ensuing papal election was surrounded by chaos and threats from a Roman mob demanding an Italian pope. The cardinals under duress elected Urban VI, but his abrasive and reformist style quickly alienated them. Many fled and declared the election invalid, proceeding to elect a rival pope, Clement VII, who established his court back in the safety of Avignon. The result was a divided Europe forced to choose sides. France, along with its allies like Scotland and Castile, naturally threw its support behind the Avignon pope. England, refusing to follow the French lead and seeing an opportunity to break French influence over the Church, staunchly supported the Roman line. What had been a dynastic and territorial war now gained a powerful layer of religious ideology. A king's cause could now be blessed by his pope and condemned as heresy by the other, turning international relations into a theological minefield. This division utterly paralyzed the Church's traditional role as a neutral peacemaker. For centuries, popes and legates had acted as mediators in conflicts between Christian kings. But now, which pope had the authority to negotiate? Any peace proposal endorsed by the Avignon pope would be instantly rejected by the English as illegitimate French propaganda. Conversely, any initiative from Rome would be dismissed by the French. The schism effectively silenced the one voice that might have appealed to a higher, shared morality above national rivalry. Instead of working for peace, each pope became a partisan cheerleader for their royal patron, using spiritual weapons like excommunication and interdict against the enemy side. This turned the war into a holy conflict for many, where defeating the other side was not just a political necessity but a religious duty, making the prospect of a negotiated compromise feel almost like a sin against God. The financial and administrative consequences were equally profound. The Church was one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe, funded by tithes, taxes, and donations from across the continent. Now, this vast financial network was split in two. Kings and nobles found themselves paying their ecclesiastical taxes to the pope their nation supported, effectively funding a parallel church bureaucracy. This diverted enormous sums of money that might otherwise have been taxed for the war effort into maintaining these rival papal courts, each with its own cardinals, diplomats, and armies. Furthermore, the constant diplomatic maneuvering to win over neutral states and sway public opinion consumed the attention of rulers. Precious time and resources that could have been spent on military strategy were instead invested in a complex, continent-wide propaganda war to legitimize one pope and delegitimize the other. Perhaps the most significant long-term effect, however, was the schism's impact on the minds of ordinary people and the intellectual class. The spectacle of two popes publicly accusing each other of being the Antichrist severely damaged the Church's aura of infallibility and unity. This crisis of authority gave rise to powerful new ideas, most notably conciliarism, the theory that a general council of the Church, representing all the faithful, held more authority than the Pope himself. This was a radical, democratic challenge to centuries of centralized papal power. While aimed at solving the schism, this line of thought had a profound side effect. It encouraged people to question all forms of top-down authority, including that of their own kings. It fostered a climate of intellectual independence and nascent nationalism, as thinkers in England and France began to argue that their own national churches should have greater autonomy from a fractured and discredited papacy. The schism, therefore, didn't just prolong the war by complicating diplomacy. It subtly began to reshape the very ideological foundations of European society, planting early seeds of reformation and national identity that would flourish long after the war itself had ended. While the French crown was reeling from military defeat and the captivity of their king, a different kind of war erupted from within, one that would expose the fragile social contract holding the kingdom together. The Jacquerie of 1358 was not a mere footnote of peasant discontent. It was a full-blown social revolution that revealed the home front as a battlefield every bit as critical as the fields of Crécy or Poitiers. The uprising took its name from the nickname Jacques Bonhomme, a term the nobility used mockingly for the common peasant, but these Jackies were no longer Bonhommes or good-natured men. They were desperate, enraged, and armed with the tools of their agrarian trade turned into instruments of rebellion, scythes, pitchforks, and axes. The immediate trigger was the utter humiliation of the French nobility following the catastrophic defeat at Poitiers 2 years prior. The knights, the supposed protectors of the realm, had not only failed but had been captured or slain, leaving the peasantry utterly defenseless against the roaming bands of English soldiers, and just as terrifying, the free companies of out-of-work mercenaries who pillaged the countryside with impunity. To the peasants, the nobility had broken their feudal oath of protection, and in doing so had forfeited their right to rule. This explosion of violence was therefore deeply personal and shockingly brutal. Castles and manor houses, the symbols of noble privilege, were put to the torch. Lords and their families were hunted down and executed, often in grisly fashion. The rebellion was not a coordinated military campaign, but a sprawling, chaotic outburst of accumulated hatred for a social order that demanded everything and offered nothing but suffering in return. For a few terrifying weeks, it seemed the entire social hierarchy of northern France was on the verge of being inverted, with the lowest orders seizing control from their paralyzed masters. The French crown, already struggling to govern without a king and to raise a ransom for his release, now faced an existential threat from within its very heartland. Precious military resources, knights, men-at-arms, and funds that were desperately needed to guard against English incursions or to negotiate from a position of strength had to be immediately redirected to crush this internal revolt. The war against England was put on hold so that France could fight a civil war for its own survival. The man who ultimately led the suppression, Charles the Bad of Navarre, was a figure of breathtaking cynicism even by the standards of the age. A royal prince with his own claim to the French throne, he saw the chaos not as a tragedy but an opportunity. By positioning himself as the savior of the nobility, he could enhance his own power and influence. His forces descended upon the rebel bands with a ferocity that matched their own. The reprisals were swift, merciless, and designed to terrorize the population back into submission. Thousands of peasants, many likely innocent bystanders, were massacred without trial. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were razed. The message was clear and brutal. The social order would be maintained through overwhelming, horrific violence. While effective in the short term, this strategy came at a terrible long-term cost. The brutal suppression, led by a self-serving opportunist like Charles the Bad, deepened the chasm of mistrust and hatred between the common people and the aristocratic class. Why should a peasant feel any loyalty to a crown that sanctioned such butchery against its own people? This alienation would fester for generations, making it harder to rally national unity in future crises. Economically, the Jacquerie was a self-inflicted wound that crippled France's capacity to wage war. The regions most affected by the uprising were some of the richest agricultural lands in the kingdom. The rebellion and its suppression laid waste to this countryside. Crops were destroyed, livestock slaughtered, mills and barns burned. The economic engine of rural France, which provided the food and taxes that fueled the army, was severely damaged. This devastation led to food shortages, a collapse in local tax revenues, and a critical reduction in the manpower pool from which future soldiers could be drawn. A kingdom cannot fight a prolonged war on an empty stomach and an empty treasury, and the Jacquerie helped ensure both would be a persistent problem for years to come. Yet, from the ashes of this traumatic event emerged a flicker of political foresight. The revolt terrified the ruling class. It was a stark warning that the patience of the common people was not infinite, and that governance based solely on extraction and oppression was a recipe for disaster. This fear prompted the first tentative steps toward reform. Advisors to the Dauphin, the future Charles V, began to understand that a measure of justice and administrative efficiency was not just morally right, but strategically necessary for the stability of the state. Efforts were made to curb the most egregious abuses of noble power and to improve the fairness of the royal tax system, not out of sudden benevolence, but out of a pragmatic desire to prevent another Jacquerie. The rebellion proved that national resilience in a total war was not just about the strength of your knights, but about the cohesion of your entire society. A kingdom tearing itself apart from within could never muster the strength to defeat a foreign enemy, a lesson that would define French statecraft for centuries to come. While the war raged across the fields of France, a dynastic struggle on the Iberian Peninsula would prove that the tides of fate could be turned not just on land, but on the open sea. The Castilian Civil War, a brutal contest for the throne of Castile, might seem a distant sideshow, but England's decision to dive headlong into this conflict had consequences that would ripple across the English Channel for decades. At its heart was a choice between two brothers with telling nicknames: Pedro the Cruel, the reigning king known for his ruthless methods, and Henry of Trastamara, his illegitimate half-brother who presented himself as a reformer. This was more than a family feud. It was a classic proxy war, France seeing an opportunity to flank its English enemy through its support behind Henry. England's King Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, saw a chance to secure a powerful ally on the continent and, just as importantly, to deny France one. They pledged their formidable military machine to Pedro. The campaign culminated in the spectacular Battle of Najarra in 1367. Here, the English tactical system proved its worth yet again. The Black Prince's army, though outnumbered and fighting in difficult terrain, used its disciplined longbowmen to shred Henry's forces, which included many French knights. It was a stunning victory that temporarily restored Pedro to his throne and seemed to be a masterstroke of English diplomacy. But this triumph was a classic example of a Pyrrhic victory. The campaign had been waged during a formal truce with France, draining the English treasury and exhausting the troops. The Black Prince's army, bogged down in Spain through a scorching summer, was ravaged by dysentery and desertion. Even worse, Pedro the Cruel proved to be a disastrously unreliable ally, failing to pay the enormous sum he had promised to cover the campaign's costs. The Black Prince returned to Aquitaine not in triumph, but in ill health and financial ruin, his army a shadow of its former self. England had won the battle, but in doing so, had severely weakened its primary war effort in France, creating an opening that the French would soon exploit. The true and most lasting consequence of this Iberian adventure, however, was not felt on the dusty plains of Spain, but on the waves of the Atlantic. The Kingdom of Castile possessed one of the most powerful and experienced navies in all of Europe. Its sailors were masters of the treacherous Bay of Biscay and the Atlantic trade routes. Before the war, Castile had been a neutral power, its fleets a potential prize for either England or France to woo. England's intervention decisively ended that neutrality. After his defeat at Nájera, Henry of Trastamara fled to France, where he regrouped with even greater support. He returned to Castile and finally defeated and killed his brother Pedro at the Battle of Montiel in 1369. Now firmly on the throne as King Henry II, he owed his crown entirely to French backing. His gratitude and his animosity toward the English who had fought for his enemy translated into a firm and lasting alliance with France. This diplomatic shift handed the French crown a weapon it had sorely lacked, a world-class navy. Almost overnight, the naval balance of power in the Channel and the Bay of Biscay tilted dramatically. The formidable Castilian fleet, with its large, ocean-going ships called naus and its seasoned admirals, was now at France's disposal. This new Franco-Castilian naval alliance immediately began to strangle English operations. They launched devastating raids on the English south coast, burning ports and terrorizing the population. More critically, they began to intercept the vital supply convoys crossing the Channel from England to its continental holdings. This naval pressure came to a head at the Battle of La Rochelle in 1372. An English relief fleet, sailing to break the French siege of the port city, was intercepted and utterly destroyed by a combined Castilian and French fleet. The defeat was a catastrophe. Not only was La Rochelle lost, handing the French a key strategic port, but English naval supremacy, which had been a cornerstone of their strategy, was shattered. The loss of La Rochelle and the constant threat from Castilian ships forced England onto the defensive at sea. It became exponentially more difficult and expensive to reinforce and supply their territories in Gascony and Brittany. The cost of goods skyrocketed due to the risk to merchant shipping, and the English crown had to invest heavily in building new ships and convoy systems, further straining its finances. This single, overlooked intervention in a foreign civil war had inadvertently gifted France the naval dominance it needed to begin its methodical reconquest of its territory. It demonstrated with brutal clarity that in a war spanning continents, no conflict is ever truly peripheral. A struggle for a throne in far-off Castile had altered the course of the 100 Years' War by changing the rules of engagement on the one element that connected all its scattered fronts, the sea. Back in England, the soaring costs of foreign wars and the disappointing returns from adventures like the Castilian campaign were creating a political crisis of their own. The once boundless optimism that had followed the great victories of Crécy and Poitiers had evaporated, replaced by a deep and weary skepticism. The treasury was empty, the taxes were high, and the common people, along with the nobles who represented them in Parliament, were demanding answers. It was in this atmosphere of fiscal panic and national frustration that the Parliament of 1371 convened at Winchester, a gathering that would quietly revolutionize how England managed its war. The focus of the Assembly's ire fell on an unexpected target: the powerful and privileged clergy who held many of the top financial and administrative posts in the government. For years, bishops and abbots had been the king's chief treasurers and advisors, managing the vast sums of money required for the war. But now, in the cold light of financial failure, Parliament saw this clerical dominance not as a blessing, but as a profound liability. They argued that these churchmen, with their loyalties divided between the king and the pope in Rome, were out of touch with the practical, gritty realities of warfare. They were theorists and theologians, not quartermasters or logisticians. The Commons, the representative body within Parliament, launched a fierce attack, accusing the clerical administrators of incompetence, mismanagement, and a lack of accountability. Their solution was radical for its time, a wholesale purge. They demanded, and successfully achieved, the replacement of these high-ranking clergymen with secular officials, laymen, often knights or lawyers, who were chosen for their practical experience and their direct accountability to Parliament and the nation, not to the distant Vatican. This shift from clerical to secular management was far more than a simple personnel change. It represented a fundamental transfer of power and a new philosophy of governance. The new secular officials approached war financing not as a theoretical exercise, but with a merchant's eye for efficiency and a soldier's understanding of necessity. They implemented stricter auditing processes to track how every penny was spent. They cracked down on the endemic corruption that had seen funds disappear into the pockets of dishonest contractors and commanders. They worked to streamline the chaotic supply chains that provided everything from arrows to salted beef for the armies abroad. This new layer of professional, secular bureaucracy brought a much-needed dose of cold, hard pragmatism to an effort that had been running on chivalric fantasy and empty coffers. Alongside this financial housecleaning, the Winchester Parliament also turned its scrutiny to the military command structure itself. Stories had filtered back to England of garrison captains pocketing the wages of their non-existent soldiers, of commanders selling off supplies for personal profit, and of generals launching vainglorious campaigns that served their own glory more than the national interest. This wasn't just corruption, it was treasonous waste that was literally costing England the war. In response, Parliament began to assert a new principle, that military commanders were not autonomous feudal lords who could wage war as they pleased, but public servants who were accountable for their use of public funds. They pushed for and began to establish systems of oversight. Commanders were required to submit detailed accounts of their expenditures. Their strategies were subject to greater review by the King's Council, which was now more influenced by the secular officials in Parliament. This move toward accountability marked a critical, early step in the professionalization of the military, transforming it from a collection of private feudal bands into a more coherent national instrument. The long-term impact of these reforms, though slow to take effect, cannot be overstated. While they did not produce an immediate turnaround on the battlefield, the French resurgence under Charles V was already gaining momentum. They provided England with the administrative and financial resilience to endure a long war of attrition. The more efficient collection and management of taxes meant that even as territories in France were lost, the English crown could still fund the defense of its remaining holdings. The improved logistics ensured that when armies were raised, they were better supplied and more reliably paid, which in turn improved morale and discipline. The Winchester Parliament of 1371 demonstrates a profound historical truth. The outcome of a war is often decided not in the heat of a cavalry charge, but in the quiet, dusty rooms where accountants balance ledgers and lawmakers demand answers. It was a turning point where the English state, under immense pressure, began to modernize itself, learning that to win a war abroad, it first had to get its own house in order. Yet for all its administrative reforms and financial adjustments, the English war effort still rested upon a fragile pillar, the health and presence of a single, irreplaceable man. Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, was far more than just the heir to the throne. He was the living embodiment of English military prowess and the very heart of its continental ambition. His long illness and eventual death in 1376 did not just represent the passing of a royal figure. It was a catastrophic decapitation of the English command structure at the worst possible moment. For years, he had been the glue holding together the entire enterprise in France. His reputation, forged in the spectacular victories at Crécy and Poitiers, was a currency that bought the loyalty of restless Gascon lords and the obedience of hardened mercenary captains. He was a figure who commanded respect not just through his title, but through proven brilliance on the battlefield and a charismatic authority that could inspire men to follow him into the most desperate situations. With his passing, that glue instantly dissolved, leaving the English leadership in France not just weakened, but fractured and adrift. The void he left was not merely a matter of finding another competent general. It was a crisis of legitimacy and morale. The prince's younger brother, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, now became the most powerful figure in the realm and the de facto leader of the war party. But Gaunt, though capable and ambitious, lacked his brother's legendary status and the unquestioned loyalty it inspired. He was seen by many as a political operator, his motives suspect. The seasoned commanders and veteran soldiers who had served loyally under the Black Prince often viewed Gaunt with skepticism or outright resentment. This created a fractured chain of command, where rivalries between noble factions simmered and coordination between different armies and garrisons began to break down. A campaign that required a single, unwavering will was now pulled in multiple directions by competing agendas and bruised egos. The English war machine, once a sharp and precise instrument, became clumsy and hesitant. This internal disarray in England arrived at the precise moment their enemy had found its own genius. In Paris, King Charles V, known as the Wise, had spent the years of truce and the Black Prince's illness executing a masterful strategy of reconquest. While the English were distracted by leadership struggles, Charles and his brilliant constable, Bertrand du Guesclin, were methodically picking apart the English Empire in France. They understood the new, grim arithmetic of post-plague warfare. They avoided pitched battles where the English longbow could dominate. Instead, they waged a war of patient sieges, economic pressure, and relentless guerrilla tactics. They would isolate an English-held town, cut its supply lines, and either starve it into submission or take it by storm, then move methodically to the next. Without the Black Prince's aggressive and unifying presence to counter this strategy, the English response was fragmented and ineffective. Garrison commanders, unsure of who to obey and when reinforcements might arrive, found themselves isolated and overwhelmed. One by one, the hard-won territories secured by the Treaty of Brétigny were clawed back by the French. The political consequences within England itself were equally devastating. The Black Prince's death meant the throne would now pass to his son, a boy of just 9 years old who would rule as Richard II. The prospect of a long minority, a child king surrounded by powerful and jealous uncles like John of Gaunt, threw English politics into a vortex of instability. The nation's attention and its resources were violently ripped away from the war in France and turned inward toward a bitter domestic struggle for control of the young king and the reins of power. The great nobles and parliamentary factions became consumed with court intrigue, jockeying for influence and preparing for the inevitable power struggles ahead. Funding and manpower for the Continental War dried up as the kingdom's energy was spent on its own internal survival. The war effort, once England's national project, was now treated as a secondary concern, a distant problem to be managed later, after the more immediate crisis at home was resolved. The contrast in fortunes could not have been more stark. As England descended into a period of weak royal authority and partisan factionalism, France under Charles V was experiencing a remarkable resurgence of centralized power and national purpose. The death of the Black Prince was the trigger that flipped the entire strategic dynamic of the war. It handed the initiative completely to the French and left the English reactionary divided and leaderless. It demonstrates with brutal clarity the immense role of individual agency in the sweep of history, a conflict that had raged for decades, involving tens of thousands of soldiers and the fate of nations, could still pivot on the health of one man. His absence created a vacuum that sucked the momentum from the English cause and allowed a cunning opponent to rewrite the map of Europe, proving that sometimes the most decisive turning point is not a battle won, but a commander lost. When kings signed treaties and armies stood down, the real war often began. Across the scarred landscapes of France, the end of official hostilities did not bring peace. It simply unleashed a new, more terrifying kind of conflict, one fought not for crowns or nations, but for pure, unadulterated survival. These were the Free Companies, vast, roving armies of mercenaries who had been discharged at the end of a campaign with nothing but their weapons and a hunger for plunder. To the peasants who endured their reign of terror, they were known as the routiers or the écorcheurs, the flayers, men who had been forged in the fires of war and now knew no other trade. They were not the chivalrous knights of romantic legend. They were a force of nature, a human hurricane that prolonged the misery of the 100 Years' War for decades, making a mockery of royal truces and turning the very concept of peace into a distant fantasy. The business model of these companies was chillingly simple and brutally effective. A band of several hundred or even several thousand hardened veterans would descend upon a region, often one already weakened by years of conflict. They would seize a strategically located castle or a fortified monastery, not to conquer it for a king, but to use it as a base of operations. From this stronghold, they would then effectively hold the entire surrounding countryside for ransom. They would send out letters, extortion notes, really, to nearby towns, villages, and abbeys, demanding vast sums of money, food, and wine in exchange for not burning everything to the ground. This practice was known as patties, a systematic protection racket on a grand scale. For the local population, it created an impossible choice: pay the mercenaries and face starvation, or refuse and face annihilation. This constant drain of resources crippled local economies already on the brink of collapse, ensuring that recovery between official phases of the war was impossible. The most terrifying aspect of the Free Companies was their statelessness. They owed allegiance to no flag, no king, and no cause beyond their own enrichment. This made them a problem that defied traditional solutions. A French king could not negotiate with them as he would with the English. There was no sovereign to make a treaty with, no territory to offer in exchange for peace. They were a hydra-headed monster. Defeating one company in battle might scatter it, only for its members to reform into two new bands elsewhere or simply hire themselves out to a different employer. Their mobility and lack of a fixed center of gravity made them nearly impossible to eradicate through conventional military campaigns. They were the ultimate unintended consequence of prolonged warfare, a violent echo that refused to fade away. Paradoxically, the very rulers who were victimized by these bands would sometimes become their patrons, a decision that almost always backfired spectacularly. In a moment of desperation or opportunity, a king or pope might hire a large company to fight for them, hoping to harness their ferocity. The most famous example is the Great Company, a massive force of thousands of mercenaries that was hired by the Marquis of Montferrat and later by the papacy to fight in Italy. While they were formidable in battle, their loyalty was as reliable as the weather. They would often extort even greater sums from their employer than from their enemies, threaten to switch sides if their pay was delayed, and generally act as an occupying army rather than an allied one. Using the Free Companies was like trying to put out a fire with gunpowder. It might work for a second, but the resulting explosion would inevitably cause even greater damage. This phenomenon fundamentally blurred the line between warfare and organized crime, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of violence. A young man whose family farm had been burned by a routier band might see no other future for himself than to join one simply to survive. The constant threat of their violence forced villages to fortify themselves and become militarized, further normalizing a state of perpetual conflict. The presence of these companies made a true, lasting peace between England and France almost unattainable for long periods, as they constantly reignited local tensions, disrupted trade, and demonstrated the utter impotence of central authorities to provide the most basic function of government, security. They were the dark, chaotic underbelly of the medieval state system, proving that once the dogs of war are unleashed, it is sometimes impossible to call them back. They turned the intervals between battles into a different kind of war, one without glory or cause, where the only victors were those who had learned to thrive in the chaos. Yet for all its grand military conquests, the English hold on France ultimately hinged on a far more intimate and fragile instrument, a marriage contract. The union between the conquering hero King Henry V of England and the French Princess Catherine of Valois in 1420 is often seen as a mere footnote to the monumental Treaty of Troyes that same year. But to view it as just a ceremonial afterthought is to miss its profound and paradoxical power. This was not a simple romance, it was a masterstroke of political theater, a living, breathing symbol designed to legitimize a breathtakingly ambitious claim. Henry was not just marrying a princess, he was marrying the very idea of France itself, attempting to sew the two rival kingdoms together with a single thread of dynastic union. The wedding was the human heart of the treaty, the mechanism that would theoretically transform an English conqueror into a French heir, ending a century of war not on the battlefield, but in the bedchamber. The symbolic weight placed upon this union was immense. For the English and their Burgundian allies, the marriage was the ultimate propaganda tool. It allowed them to frame Henry's staggering acquisition of the French crown not as a brutal foreign occupation, but as a peaceful, lawful succession. Portraying him as the devoted husband to a French queen and the loyal son-in-law to the ailing King Charles VI helped soften the image of the fierce warrior who had slaughtered the French chivalry at Agincourt. He was now family. This narrative was crucial for winning over the crucial, wavering segment of the French population that was weary of war and desperate for stability. It offered a vision of reconciliation and a united future, a dual monarchy where two great nations could coexist under a single, strong ruler. The birth of a son, the future Henry VI, just a year later, seemed to cement this vision, creating a tangible heir to both thrones, a living promise of a lasting peace. But this very symbol, so potent for one side, became a powerful rallying cry for the other. To the French factions that remained loyal to the Dauphin, the disinherited son of Charles VI, Henry's marriage to Catherine was not a beautiful union but a grotesque parody, a forced political rape of the French royal line. They saw it as the ultimate humiliation, the Valois bloodline, the sacred heart of French monarchy, being appropriated by the English enemy to serve his own dynastic ambitions. Catherine, in their eyes, was less a queen and more a pawn, a trophy of war used to lend a veneer of legitimacy to a naked power grab. This perception galvanized the resistance around the Dauphin. It transformed a complex dynastic dispute into a clearer, more emotionally resonant struggle against a foreign invader who had not only taken their land but had now dared to take their very royal family. The marriage, intended to unify, instead provided the perfect fuel for a burgeoning sense of French nationalism. The legal and political reality that followed Henry V's shockingly early death in 1422 exposed the fatal flaw in this grand design. The treaty and the marriage had been built entirely around the formidable person of Henry himself, his military genius, his forceful will, his aura of invincibility. He was the only one who could possibly have held this precarious dual monarchy together. His death left the entire edifice in the hands of an infant, Henry VI, and a fractious council of English regents. The result was a political nightmare of divided loyalties. Was the baby king of England first, or of France? Which set of advisors should hold sway? The English regents governing in his name naturally prioritized English interests, often ruling their French territories with a heavy and exploitative hand, which only confirmed the worst fears of the French populace and further alienated potential supporters. This inherent instability created a vacuum of power in France that the Dauphin's party was quick to exploit. The resistance, once on the verge of collapse, found new life. The cause was no longer just about restoring the rightful French king. It was about liberating the kingdom from the incompetent and foreign rule of a child king's regents. The marriage that was supposed to bring peace had instead created a deeply unstable and unworkable political situation, one that made a lasting diplomatic solution impossible. It forced the conflict to continue, not as a war of conquest, but as a war of liberation. The union of Henry and Catherine, therefore, stands as one of history's greatest ironies, a diplomatic move designed to end a war that instead ensured its continuation by providing the opposition with its most powerful moral and nationalist cause. It proved that a crown could be won by treaty and sealed with a marriage, but the loyalty of a nation could only be earned. While the legend of Joan of Arc and the lifting of the siege of Orleans rightfully captures the imagination, the story of the money, the supplies, and the sheer economic endurance required to sustain the blockade, and the resistance is a drama all its own, one that unfolded not on the ramparts but in the ledgers and the marketplaces. For the English commanders, the decision to lay siege to Orleans was a colossal financial gamble. This was no quick investment. It was a long-term, resource-draining enterprise. Maintaining a besieging army of thousands of men for months on end was phenomenally expensive. Every single soldier needed to be paid, fed, and equipped. The supply line stretching back to English-held Paris and across the Channel to England itself became vital, fragile arteries that were constantly threatened by French partisan attacks and the worsening winter weather. The cost of hiring Burgundian and other auxiliary troops, of procuring thousands of arrows, of building and maintaining siege engines and artillery, and of shipping vast quantities of salted meat, grain, and ale was bleeding the English treasury dry. This financial strain forced the English Regency government to make difficult choices, diverting funds and manpower from other fronts in Normandy and Gascony, effectively weakening their overall strategic position across France for the sake of this one symbolic prize. For the city of Orleans itself, the siege was an economic stranglehold. The city was a vital commercial hub, a bustling port on the Loire River that connected the trade routes of northern and southern France. The English blockade severed this lifeline completely. Suddenly, the vibrant flow of goods, wine, salt, cloth, and grain came to a screeching halt. Inside the walls, the economy didn't just slow down, it warped into a desperate struggle for survival. With no new supplies entering, prices for basic necessities like bread and firewood skyrocketed. Hoarding and black markets emerged, creating bitter divisions between the wealthy who could afford to pay exorbitant prices and the poor who faced starvation. The disruption to the surrounding agricultural land was equally devastating. Farmers' fields were trampled by armies, their crops stolen or burned, and their livestock slaughtered. This not only created immediate food shortages, but also destroyed the productive capacity of the region for the following growing season. ensuring that economic hardship would linger long after the last siege engine had been dismantled. Yet, this economic pressure also forged a powerful weapon for the French: the morale of a unified citizenry. The shared suffering within the walls of Orleans, the collective experience of hunger and fear, transformed the city's defense from a military operation into a popular cause. The wealthy merchants and the common laborers found themselves in the same boat, their fates intertwined. This sense of communal defiance became a critical, intangible asset. It galvanized the garrison to fight harder and encouraged the populace to endure greater privation, knowing that surrender would mean not just defeat but economic ruin and subjugation. The city's stubborn resistance became a beacon, a story that spread across France and inspired other regions to hold out against the English. This psychological and economic endurance was the crucial foundation upon which any military relief effort would have to build. Without the city's will to withstand the economic siege, no relieving army, no matter how inspired, could have succeeded. When Joan of Arc and the French relief force finally arrived, her most famous contribution was, of course, the spiritual and military impetus she provided. However, her presence also had an immediate and tangible economic effect. Her very arrival and the fresh troops and supplies that came with her broke the psychological and logistical monopoly of the English blockade. It demonstrated to the beleaguered citizens that they were not forgotten, that the French crown was still investing in their survival. More practically, her audacious attacks on the English bastilles, the fortified positions surrounding the city, were as much about severing the besiegers' own supply lines as they were about achieving a military victory. By capturing these forts, the French forces disrupted the English army's access to its own provisions and communications, effectively turning the economic tables. The besiegers suddenly found themselves the ones who were isolated, undersupplied, and vulnerable. The ultimate French victory, therefore, was a triumph of economic resilience as much as military fervor. The lifting of the siege did not just mean a battle won, it meant the reopening of the Loire River, the resumption of vital trade, and the salvation of a key economic center from destruction. For the English, the failure at Orleans was a catastrophic financial loss. The vast sums of money and mountains of material invested in the siege had been utterly wasted, leaving their war chest depleted and their strategic momentum broken. The episode stands as a powerful testament to the fact that medieval warfare was often a brutal arithmetic of logistics and economics. A general needed to calculate not only how to break a wall, but how to pay for the army that would do it, how to feed them for months on end, and how to withstand the economic counter-pressure that the besieged would inevitably exert in return. The Siege of Orleans proves that the longest sieges were often won not by the army with the best knights, but by the side whose economy and whose people's will could endure the longest. For centuries, the English longbow had been the undisputed master of the battlefields of France, a weapon so effective it could decide the fate of kingdoms. At Agincourt, it had mowed down the flower of French chivalry, and for generations, English commanders had built their entire strategy around its devastating power. They would find a strong defensive position, plant their dismounted men at arms in the center, and unleash a storm of arrows that would break a charging army long before it reached their lines. It was a system that had brought them legendary victories and had come to define medieval warfare itself. But by the spring of 1450, a new sound was beginning to echo across the fields of Normandy, a deep, thunderous roar that would signal the end of the longbow's reign and the bloody dawn of a new age. The Battle of Formigny was not one of the war's grand, set-piece clashes led by kings. It was a brutal, desperate encounter between an English force trying to relieve the besieged town of Caen and a French army determined to stop them. The English, as always, adopted their classic defensive formation, a bristling hedgehog of pikemen and archers on a small rise of ground, confident that their longbows would once again carry the day. The initial French cavalry charges were indeed broken by the familiar, withering arrow storm, but then the French commander, the Comte de Clermont, introduced a variable the English had never before faced in an open battle. He brought forward two small, mobile cannons known as culverines and had them set up on the flanks of the English position. These were not the massive, immobile bombards used for sieges. These were field guns designed to be moved and aimed with relative speed. The effect was both tactical and profoundly psychological. The cannons did not need to score a direct hit to be effective. Instead of aiming at individual soldiers, the French gunners fired into the dense, packed ranks of the English formation. Each shot, even if it missed, sent a terrifying cannonball skipping and ricocheting through the lines, mangling men and horses with a force no arrow could match. The noise alone was a weapon, a deafening, unnatural blast that shattered concentration and sowed panic. More importantly, the cannons forced the English archers to break their own disciplined formation. To eliminate this new threat, a group of English soldiers had to abandon their secure defensive position and launch a desperate, unsupported charge across open ground to capture the guns. While they succeeded in taking the two cannons, this impulsive act fatally fractured their once impenetrable line. It created a gap, a moment of chaos and disorganization, which fresh French reinforcements were quick to exploit. The English army was surrounded and annihilated. The longbow had been outthought and outgunned, not by a better weapon of its own kind, but by something entirely different. The true significance of Formigny was not the number of cannons used, it was pitifully small, but the powerful lesson it delivered to every military commander in Europe. It provided a clear, undeniable blueprint for how to defeat the previously invincible English tactical system. Gunpowder artillery could neutralize the longbow's greatest advantage, its ability to disrupt and break an attack from a distance. Now the attacker had a weapon with even greater range and far more terrifying impact. It could force a defensive army to move, to break its shape, and to make fatal mistakes. The battle proved that artillery was no longer just a tool for smashing castle walls. It had earned its place on the open battlefield as a decisive arm of the military. In the years immediately following Formigny, both the French and English, and indeed every European power, would dramatically increase their investment in developing lighter, more mobile, and faster-firing field guns. The arms race had begun, and warfare would never be the same. Beyond the immediate tactical shift, the rise of gunpowder artillery signaled a deeper, more philosophical change in the nature of war. For centuries, combat had been dominated by the ideal of chivalry, where the individual skill, bravery, and strength of an armored knight on horseback were considered the highest martial virtues. The longbow had already challenged this notion, proving that a commoner with a simple weapon could defeat a nobleman in shining plate armor, but gunpowder delivered the final, humiliating blow. A cannon required no lifetime of training, no noble birth, and no great physical strength to operate effectively. Its power came from chemistry and engineering, not from human muscle or courage. It was the ultimate democratizing and dehumanizing force, a well-aimed shot from a cannon, fired by a common gunner who might never even see the face of his enemy, could obliterate a knight who had trained for war since childhood. The very foundation of medieval military culture began to crumble, making way for the early modern era, where technology, discipline, and industrial capacity would matter more than bloodlines and personal valor. Formigny, therefore, stands as a quiet but immensely significant graveside. It was the battle where the art of war, as it had been practiced for 500 years, was buried, and the terrifying modern science of warfare was born. Even as Charles VII, now known as the Victorious, was methodically reclaiming his kingdom from the English, he faced a far more intimate and insidious threat, one that emerged not from across the Channel, but from within the very halls of his own court. The Bratigny of 1440 was a rebellion with a curious name, borrowed from a recent uprising in Prague, but its motives were deeply rooted in the old France, a France that was rapidly disappearing thanks to the king's own reforms. This was not a popular revolt of desperate peasants. It was a mutiny of the privileged, a coordinated strike by some of the most powerful nobles in the land, including the king's own son, the Dauphin Louis, and the mighty Duke of Bourbon. Their grievance was not with the English enemy, but with their own king's vision for a modern, centralized state. They saw Charles's sweeping reforms not as a path to victory, but as a direct assault on their ancient feudal privileges. The heart of their anger lay in two revolutionary changes Charles was implementing. First was the financial reform. To fund the war without begging for money from the Estates General, Charles had made temporary wartime taxes permanent. The taille, a direct land tax, became a reliable annual revenue stream that flowed directly into the royal treasury, independent of the nobility. This gave the crown an unprecedented financial autonomy, freeing it from the need to negotiate with its powerful vassals for every livre. Second, and even more threatening to the noble class, was the military reform. Charles and his advisors were creating the first standing professional army in French history. This Compagnie's d'ordonnance would consist of paid, full-time soldiers organized into companies under the direct command of royal captains. For the great nobles, this was an existential threat. Their power was based on the feudal levy, the right to raise armies from their own lands and lead them into battle for the king. This system made them indispensable. A professional royal army would render them obsolete, transferring military power from their private hands directly to the crown, and stripping them of their primary purpose and source of prestige. The rebellion, though bearing the fashionable name Bratigny, was thus a last desperate stand of the old feudal order against the rising tide of the modern state. The rebellious dukes and princes likely expected a swift victory, believing the king would back down when faced with the united opposition of his greatest subjects. They underestimated their monarch completely. Charles VII, who had begun his reign as the disinherited King of Burgesses, had been tempered by decades of adversity into a shrewd and ruthless ruler. He moved with stunning speed and decisiveness. He leveraged his new financial independence to hire mercenaries, and he used the very core of his new professional army, those units already established, to crush the rebels. Significantly, he also turned their own feudal ideology against them. He appealed to the lesser nobility and the common people by portraying the rebels as selfish traitors who were undermining the war effort and jeopardizing the security of the realm for their own greedy ends. This masterful propaganda isolated the rebellious magnates, denying them the broader support they needed. The king's victory over the Bratigny was far more significant than a simple suppression of dissent. It was the moment the abstract idea of royal absolutism became an unignorable political reality. By defeating the most powerful men in France, Charles demonstrated that the crown's authority was now superior to that of any individual duke or prince, even his own heir. The rebellion's failure sent a shockwave through the aristocracy. The old rules were gone. The crown would no longer be held hostage by the whims of its great vassals. This resounding assertion of royal power gave Charles the political capital to accelerate his reforms at a breathtaking pace. the professional army was expanded and refined without further opposition. The tax system was strengthened, providing a steady and predictable flow of money to pay for this new military machine. The direct link between this internal victory and the external war effort was immediate and dramatic. With a loyal, unified command structure and a professional army that could be deployed year-round without being disbanded after a single campaign, Charles could now plan and execute complex, multi-year strategies. The army was no longer a temporary gathering of feudal lords and their retinues, each with their own agenda. It was a single, sharp instrument wielded by the king. This newfound operational cohesion was the decisive factor in the Lightning Campaign to reconquer Normandy between 1449 and 1450. Towns fell in rapid succession because the French army could maintain constant pressure, expertly coordinating sieges and movements in a way that the fragmented, feudal English command could not match. The Bratigny, therefore, was the critical, hidden battle that made the famous victories possible. It proved that the most important war a king often has to win is not against a foreign invader, but against the entrenched interests within his own kingdom. The lesson was clear: a nation cannot project strength abroad until it has first consolidated authority at home, a principle that would become the bedrock of the early modern nation-state. For over 300 years, the region of Gascony in southwestern France had been more than just another English possession. It was a cornerstone of the English economy and identity, a verdant land of vineyards and bustling ports that felt almost like a second home. Its final loss between 1451 and 1453 is often treated as the inevitable closing chapter of the Hundred Years' War, the last sad note in a long song of defeat. But to see it only as a military event is to miss its true, devastating impact. This was not merely the surrender of territory on a map. It was a catastrophic amputation of England's economic lifeline, a financial shockwave that would reverberate through English society for generations and help plunge the nation into a bloody civil war. The heart of this catastrophe was wine. Gascony was the primary source of the wine that English society, from the nobility down to the prosperous merchant class, consumed in vast quantities. This was not a luxury trade, it was a fundamental staple of daily life and commerce. The city of Bordeaux was the vibrant hub of this enterprise, its port filled with the sails of English ships carrying thousands of barrels of claret back to London, Bristol, and Southampton. This trade was the engine of a complex and highly profitable commercial ecosystem. English merchants exported wool and cloth to Gascony and used the profits to buy wine, which they then sold at home or re-exported to other northern European markets. The royal treasury took a cut at every stage through customs duties, taxes, and port fees, making the crown a silent partner in every transaction. The loss of Gascony didn't just mean England had to find a new wine supplier. It meant the deliberate destruction of this entire, centuries-old economic circuit. Overnight, a massive source of royal revenue and mercantile profit simply vanished, leaving a gaping hole in the nation's finances. This sudden economic void forced a desperate and painful restructuring of the entire English economy. With the wine trade crippled, the nation became dangerously over-reliant on a single commodity, wool. England's raw wool and finished cloth were still in high demand, particularly in the manufacturing cities of the Low Countries like Bruges and Ghent. But this dependence created a precarious vulnerability. The English economy was now hitched to the volatile whims of the Flemish market. Any disruption in that relationship, a trade embargo, a political falling out, or a recession in the cloth industry, would immediately threaten England's economic stability. This reliance also weakened England's diplomatic hand. Rulers of the Low Countries could now use trade access as a political weapon, knowing that England desperately needed to sell its wool. The steady, diversified income from the Gascon trade had provided a cushion. Without it, England was walking an economic tightrope without a net. The human cost of this loss was just as profound, and it fell heavily on the powerful merchant classes of London and the coastal towns. These were the men who had built their fortunes and their political influence on the Gascon trade. Suddenly, their businesses were in ruins, their networks shattered, and their social status threatened. This created a deep well of bitterness and resentment against the government of King Henry VI. The merchant elite, once a pillar of support for the crown's foreign wars, now saw the Lancastrian monarchy as incompetent stewards who had lost them their livelihood. Their disillusionment was critical. When the political crisis of the Wars of the Roses began to erupt just a few years later, this powerful and wealthy segment of society withheld its support from the king. Many even threw their financial backing and their civic influence behind rival factions, most notably the Yorkists, who promised stronger leadership and perhaps a chance to reclaim lost commercial glory. The fall of Gascony, therefore, didn't just bankrupt the government. It turned key stakeholders against the regime, actively financing the opposition that would seek to tear it down. Ultimately, the loss eroded the very foundation of royal authority, legitimacy. For centuries, the kings of England had justified the immense cost and sacrifice of the war in France by pointing to the glorious possessions they held there, with Gascony as the glittering prize. The war had to be fought, taxes had to be paid, and men had to die, all to protect this vital part of the realm. When Gascony was finally lost, that entire justification collapsed. The crown had asked for everything and delivered nothing but failure. The king, Henry VI, was seen as a weak and pious man who had squandered the martial legacy of his father, Henry V. The defeat in France was the ultimate proof of his inadequacy. This massive blow to the crown's prestige and credibility made it appear vulnerable, opening the door for ambitious nobles like Richard, Duke of York, to challenge its authority. The question was no longer if the king could govern France, but whether he was even fit to govern England. The economic shock of losing Gascony provided the motive for rebellion, while the stain of military failure provided the opportunity. The two forces combined to create a perfect storm, ensuring that the end of the foreign war in France would be immediately followed by the beginning of a far more intimate and brutal conflict at home. While the chronicles of kings and the strategies of generals dominate our histories, the relentless, quiet labor that truly fueled the war effort was shouldered by a population working to its limits, and at the heart of this effort were women, whose indispensable role has been one of the most consistently overlooked aspects of the entire conflict. We rightly celebrate Joan of Arc for her brief, meteoric impact, but for every Joan, there were tens of thousands of anonymous women whose daily, unheralded toil provided the economic and logistical foundation without which no army could have marched, no siege could have been sustained, and no kingdom could have survived a war lasting more than a century. Their story is not one of dramatic battles, but of resilience, adaptation, and an often desperate holding together of the very fabric of society under the immense strain of perpetual war. In the vast countryside of England and France, the absence of men created a profound demographic shift that forced women into roles of unprecedented responsibility. With husbands, fathers, and sons away for years, or never returning at all, the management of the family farm or estate fell squarely on the shoulders of wives and daughters. This was far more than simple maintenance. These women became de facto chief executives, making critical decisions about which crops to plant, when to harvest, and how to manage livestock. They negotiated with local merchants, settled disputes with tenants, and ensured that rents and taxes were paid to the lord or the crown. The continued agricultural output from these countless smallholdings was the absolute bedrock of the wartime economy. It was the bread that fed the towns, the wool that was woven into cloth for uniforms, and the hay that fed the army's horses. A single estate failing could be a tragedy. A widespread failure of this female-led system would have meant national collapse, making these women the unsung stewards of their nation's most vital resource. Within the crowded, walled cities, the contribution of women was equally vital but took on a more industrial character. The war machine had an insatiable appetite for material, and urban workshops were the engines that supplied it. In the textile industries, women were the dominant workforce. They carded wool, spun it into yarn, and wove it into the heavy cloth used for tents, uniforms, and blankets that were essential for armies campaigning in all weathers. The arms trade, too, relied heavily on female labor. While the master blacksmith might forge a sword blade or an arrowhead, the countless supporting tasks, stitching the leather scabbards, fletching arrows with feathers, assembling pieces of armor, and packing supplies for shipment, were largely performed by women and children in small workshops and homes. This decentralized manufacturing network turned entire cities into supply depots, and women were the crucial cogs in that machine, their skilled hands turning raw materials into the instruments of war. Perhaps the most dramatic and dangerous contributions came from women on the front lines of local defense. In towns and villages across France, particularly those in contested regions, the threat of attack was constant. When a local lord was away and his garrison stretched thin, the duty of organizing a community's resistance often fell to the women. There are numerous accounts from chronicles of women helping to organize town watches, mobilizing to repair crumbling walls and fortifications under threat of siege, and even taking up positions on the ramparts themselves. During a siege, their role became even more critical. They were the logistical backbone of the defense, managing food and water rations, tending to the wounded, and hauling stones and pots of boiling oil to the walls to repel attackers. Their morale and determination often meant the difference between a community that held out for a relief force and one that surrendered out of despair. This was a form of combat, not with sword and lance, but with spirit and sheer stubborn endurance. The legal and financial records of the period offer tantalizing glimpses of women who didn't just fill in for absent men, but carved out significant economic power for themselves. With high mortality rates among men, many widows inherited their husbands' businesses, from taverns and bakeries to merchant shipping ventures and artisanal guilds. These women, now heads of their household in law as well as in practice, continued to operate these enterprises, signing contracts, settling debts, and sometimes even expanding their trade. In port cities like Bordeaux and Southampton, women are recorded as merchants shipping goods across the Channel. In a society that legally subjugated them, the prolonged emergency of the war created unexpected cracks in the patriarchal structure, allowing some women a measure of economic independence and influence that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. They became essential taxpayers and creditors, their financial stability directly contributing to the Crown's ability to fund its armies. To overlook this vast collective effort is to misunderstand the fundamental nature of the 100 Years' War. This was not a conflict fought only by professional soldiers on distant fields. It was a total war that demanded the mobilization of entire societies. The relentless pressure of a century of fighting necessitated the utilization of every available pair of hands, regardless of gender. The silent, constant labor of women in the fields, workshops, and homes provided the economic continuity that allowed the war to continue year after year, decade after decade. Their story adds a crucial and deeply human dimension to the history. moving us beyond maps of battles and lists of treaties to reveal the intricate web of human effort that sustained nations through an epic struggle. It reminds us that history is built not only on the deeds of the famous but on the resilience of the anonymous, whose collective strength forms the unshakable foundation upon which kingdoms stand or fall. We often picture medieval warfare as a grand clash of human wills, where victory is won by the strength of arms and the brilliance of generals, but this perspective ignores a far more powerful and utterly indifferent player on the battlefield, the climate itself. The weather was not merely a backdrop to the 100 Years' War, it was an active, unpredictable, and often decisive participant that could humble the most carefully laid plans of kings and commanders. Armies that marched with confidence could be brought to their knees not by enemy steel, but by a sudden downpour, an early frost, or a parching drought. To understand the true flow of the conflict, we must look beyond troop movements and treaties and into the ancient records of unseasonable cold, relentless rain, and failed harvests that silently shaped the destiny of nations. The most direct and brutal impact came from the sheer, grinding misery that bad weather inflicted on campaigning armies. These were not the insulated, professional forces of a later age. They were collections of men and thousands of horses living almost entirely in the open. A campaign season that stretched into a harsh autumn or an early winter was a recipe for disaster. The deep freeze that gripped Europe during the winter of 1434 to 1435 is a perfect example. This was not a picturesque dusting of snow. It was a catastrophic cold snap that brought military operations across France to a complete and shivering halt. Rivers and roads, the vital arteries for moving supplies and men, became frozen solid or impassable with mud upon the thaw. Supply convoys simply could not get through. Within weeks, besieging armies found themselves not as conquerors, but as trapped and starving communities, far more concerned with finding their next meal than with prosecuting a siege. Malnutrition quickly opened the door to disease, with dysentery, typhus, and respiratory illnesses spreading through cramped, cold, and filthy camps with a ferocity that could wipe out an army more efficiently than any enemy charge. A general's greatest adversary in these moments was not the opposing commander, but the silent, creeping specter of sickness and starvation bred by the cold. Beyond the slow grind of a bad season, weather could also deliver an immediate tactical masterpiece or catastrophe on the day of battle itself. The most famous example is, of course, the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. The days leading up the battle had been marked by torrential rains, turning the recently plowed field between two woods into a vast, sucking quagmire of thick clay mud. The French plan, which relied on a massive, overwhelming cavalry charge by heavily armored knights, was perfectly reasonable for a dry, open field, but on that sodden ground it became a death trap. The magnificent war horses, each carrying hundreds of pounds of rider and armor, sank into the mire, their charge slowing to a labored, struggling walk. They became easy, packed targets for the English longbowmen. Meanwhile, the English men-at-arms, who largely fought on foot, had the advantage of choosing a defensive position and waiting. The wet ground neutralized the French army's greatest asset, its heavy cavalry, before a single arrow was even fired. King Henry V's genius lay not in some complex tactical innovation, but in recognizing how the weather had altered the battlefield and positioning his army to exploit that natural advantage to its fullest. Perhaps the most profound yet slow-moving climatic influence was the specter of drought and famine. Warfare in the medieval period was acutely tied to the agricultural calendar. Armies were typically raised after the spring planting and were expected to be disbanded by the autumn harvest so that the soldiers, who were mostly farmers, could return to bring in the crops. A prolonged drought disrupted this entire delicate cycle. When the rains failed, the crops withered in the fields. This created a domino effect of disaster. First, the peasantry, who formed the bulk of any army's rank and file, could not be spared from their starving villages. Manpower for new campaigns dried up just as literally as the fields. Second, the price of grain and foodstuffs skyrocketed, making it astronomically expensive for a king to feed even a modest army on campaign. Third, and most critically, a famine-struck countryside could not support a marching army. The traditional method of feeding a force, living off the land by foraging and pillaging, became impossible when the land itself had nothing to give. An invading army marching into a drought-stricken region would find itself in a barren wasteland, unable to replenish its supplies, and would be forced into a humiliating retreat without ever sighting the enemy. In this way, the absence of rain could prove to be a more effective defense than the strongest castle wall. Faced with this unpredictable and omnipotent force, commanders were forced to become amateur meteorologists and masters of adaptation. The timing of a campaign was everything. Launching an invasion too early in the spring risked encountering impassable muddy roads. Starting too late in the autumn risked being caught by early snows. The need to coordinate military strategy with the rhythms of the harvest and the patterns of the weather added a layer of immense complexity to every decision. A king's reputation could rest not on his courage, but on his ability to read the signs of an approaching storm and call off a campaign in time to save his army. This constant negotiation with the elements meant that the war was fought in fits and starts, with long periods of inactivity enforced not by truces, but by the seasons themselves. The climate imposed a natural rhythm on the conflict, a series of pauses and bursts of activity that often had little to do with the political desires of the warring parties. It was a constant, humbling reminder that for all their power and ambition, human leaders were still ultimately at the mercy of the natural world, their grandest strategies subject to the whims of the wind and the rain. Beyond the clash of armies and the strategies of kings, the 100 Years' War was also fought in a far more intimate and unexpected arena, the comfortable captivity of high-ranking prisoners. The practice of ransoming captured nobles is often romanticized as a chivalric courtesy, a gentleperson's agreement between enemies who respected each other's station. But to see it only as a quaint custom is to miss its profound role as an engine of cultural exchange and a powerful, if unofficial, economic system that bound the two warring kingdoms together in complex ways. For the elite, captivity was rarely a brutal experience of dungeons and chains. It was more often a form of enforced, and often quite luxurious, residency. A captured knight or lord was a valuable asset, to be housed and treated well in the expectation of a hefty ransom payment. This created a strange parallel world where the enemy was not a faceless foe to be hated, but a guest to be negotiated with, a person whose habits, language, and ideas could be observed up close for years on end. The most significant captives became unwitting students of their enemy's culture. Take the case of Charles d'Orléans, the French prince and renowned poet captured at the Battle of Agincourt. He would spend the next 25 years of his life as a prisoner in England, moving between various castles and aristocratic households. During this long exile, he was immersed in English life. He learned the language fluently, read English literature, and engaged in philosophical debates with his captors. More importantly, he continued to write poetry, and his work from this period shows a fascinating fusion of French lyrical tradition with the emerging styles and themes of English verse. When he was finally ransomed and returned to France, he brought back more than just memories. He brought a deep, nuanced understanding of the English court and its intellectual life. He established a famous literary court at Blois that became a cultural hub, and his unique perspective, forged in captivity, helped shape the artistic dialogue between the two nations long after the war had ended. On the other side of the coin, the enormous ransom payments themselves acted as a massive, forced transfer of wealth across the Channel, with dramatic economic consequences. The most famous example is the ransom for King John II of France, captured at Poitiers in 1356. The initial payment was set at an almost unimaginable sum, 3 million gold écus. To put that in perspective, it was roughly double the entire annual revenue of the French crown. The French monarchy had to impose devastating new taxes and essentially bankrupt the treasury to secure their king's release. This financial drain crippled the French economy for a generation, fueling the social unrest that led to revolts like the Jacquerie. For the English, John's ransom was a colossal windfall. It filled King Edward III's coffers, allowing him to finance new campaigns, reward his supporters lavishly, and project an image of immense power and wealth. Yet this sudden influx of capital also had inflationary effects and arguably made the English overly reliant on this kind of war booty, creating a dangerous cycle where the financial health of the kingdom came to depend on the continued capture of high-value prisoners. This system of captivity and ransom also wove a complex web of personal relationships that often transcended national loyalty. A nobleman who held a valuable prisoner developed a direct personal stake in their well-being and eventual release. The captive, in turn, often formed bonds of respect and even friendship with their captor. These personal connections could have surprising diplomatic consequences. A lord who had been well treated during his captivity might later show clemency to his former captor's family or lands. They could act as back-channel negotiators, using their unique cross-cultural understanding to facilitate truces or advocate for peace. These networks of obligation and mutual respect created an informal layer of diplomacy that operated alongside official state channels, sometimes softening the edges of the conflict and creating opportunities for de-escalation that purely political considerations would never have allowed. In this light, the experience of captivity emerges as far more than a simple interlude between battles. It was a powerful, if involuntary, mechanism for cultural diffusion, slowly blending the artistic, linguistic, and intellectual traditions of England and France during a period of official hostility. It functioned as a brutal but effective economic regulator, transferring vast sums of money from one nation to another and directly influencing the fiscal policies that funded the war. And perhaps most intriguingly, it fostered a transnational aristocratic community whose personal bonds and shared experiences could, at times, counterbalance the nationalist fervor that fueled the fighting. The ransom system ensured that even as their kingdoms fought, their elites remained connected, learning from one another and building the personal relationships that would eventually help pick up the pieces when the long war finally came to an end. Yet for all the money spent on armies and the blood spilled on battlefields, the most enduring weapons of the 100 Years' War were often forged not from steel, but from words and images. Both England and France waged a relentless, sophisticated, and often overlooked battle for the hearts and minds of their people, a propaganda war that evolved from simple dynastic claims into powerful narratives of national identity and divine purpose. This struggle to control public opinion was not a sideshow. It was a vital front that determined whether kings could secure the taxes and troops needed to continue the fight, making the manipulation of perception as crucial as any military maneuver. The English effort was a masterclass in legalistic and historical persuasion. From the very start of the conflict, Edward III's advisors understood that a simple claim of birthright was not enough to justify the immense cost and risk of invading France. They needed to frame their cause as not only legitimate but morally righteous. To do this, they produced a flood of official documents, genealogical charts, and proclamations that were disseminated to Parliament, the nobility, and the merchant classes. These texts meticulously laid out Edward's claim to the French throne, often tracing his lineage back to William the Conqueror and Charlemagne to create an air of historical inevitability. But this dry legalism was brilliantly complemented by a vibrant popular culture campaign. Minstrels and poets composed stirring ballads and chronicles, like those of Jean Froissart, which were read aloud in taverns and public squares. These stories celebrated English victories at Crécy and Poitiers not as mere military successes, but as triumphs of a just cause led by virtuous, divinely favored kings. They portrayed the English soldier as a disciplined, pious underdog, while often depicting the French knight as arrogant, decadent, and doomed by his own pride. This narrative served a critical financial purpose. By portraying the war as righteous and winnable, the Crown could more easily persuade a sometimes reluctant English Parliament to approve the heavy taxes required to keep the armies in the field. The French response, particularly after the devastating early defeats, initially struggled to counter this effective English narrative. However, they gradually developed a propaganda strategy that would prove even more potent, one that shifted the focus from the rights of a king to the soul of a nation. This transformation found its ultimate symbol in Joan of Arc. The French court, and especially the faction around the Dauphin Charles, brilliantly orchestrated the Maid of Orleans's public image. They presented her not as a random peasant girl, but as a heaven-sent savior, a living miracle whose very existence proved that God had chosen the French cause. Her victories were publicized not as tactical achievements but as divine interventions, a message tirelessly repeated by preachers in sermons across the kingdom. This religious framing was incredibly powerful. It gave the French people, demoralized by decades of defeat, a transcendent reason to believe and to fight. It transformed the conflict from a dynastic squabble into a holy war for the very survival of France itself, a sacred mission to expel the foreign invader and restore God's chosen king to his rightful throne. After Joan's capture and martyrdom, her story became the most powerful piece of propaganda in the entire war, an enduring legend of national sacrifice that continues to resonate centuries later. The methods of disseminating these competing messages were remarkably advanced for the medieval world, creating a primitive but effective information network. Official proclamations were read by town criers in market squares, ensuring even the illiterate populace heard the king's version of events. Preachers who held immense sway over their congregations were given talking points and instructed to deliver sermons that framed the war in spiritual terms, whether it was the righteousness of the English king's claim or the divine sanction of the French resistance. Artists and engravers were commissioned to produce works that visualized these narratives. Illuminated manuscripts showed angelic hosts favoring one side or the other, and even coins were minted with symbols and inscriptions designed to bolster royal authority and the legitimacy of the cause. This multi-pronged approach ensured that propaganda permeated every level of society, from the educated noble reading a chronicle to the common farmer listening to a ballad or gazing at a stained glass window. The long-term impact of this centuries-long war of words extended far beyond the battlefield, fundamentally shaping the historical memory and national identities of both England and France. The narratives crafted during the conflict became the foundational myths of each nation. In England, the stories of glorious victories against overwhelming odds fostered a lasting sense of martial pride and a belief in the nation's special destiny, a sentiment that would fuel later imperial ambitions. In France, the trauma of invasion and the powerful story of Joan's redemption forged a potent concept of national unity and a belief in the indivisibility of the French state, a cornerstone of French identity to this day. This struggle for hearts and minds demonstrates a profound truth about prolonged conflict. Victory is not only achieved by the army that controls the territory, but by the side that succeeds in controlling the story. The 100 Years' War stands as a stark early example of what we now call information warfare, proving that the pen, the printing press, and the preacher's pulpit can be just as decisive as the longbow and the lance in the long and bloody struggle for a nation's soul. Yet for all the dramatic battles and heroic stands, some of the most decisive shifts in the war occurred not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, torch-lit chambers where diplomats exchanged sealed letters and argued over maps. The single most consequential of these diplomatic revolutions was the Treaty of Arras in 1435, an event so pivotal it effectively broke the back of the English cause in France. We often remember it as a simple act of betrayal the moment the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, switched sides, but to label it merely as treachery is to miss the breathtakingly complex and cynical chess game that unfolded, a masterpiece of realpolitik that reveals the true engine of medieval warfare, not national loyalty but cold, calculated self-interest. To understand why Philip's shift was so earth-shattering, you have to appreciate what the Burgundian alliance meant to England. The Duchy of Burgundy was not just another French region, it was a powerhouse. Under Philip the Good, it had grown into a vast and wealthy state that sprawled across eastern France and deep into the Low Countries, encompassing modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. For decades, England's entire strategy had been built upon this alliance. Burgundy provided a safe haven for English armies to regroup and resupply. It offered a secure overland route for troops marching from Calais to the heart of France. Most importantly, the rich cities of Flanders, which were under Burgundian control, were the primary buyers of English wool, the commodity that financed the entire war effort. The English war machine literally ran on wool, and Burgundy controlled the market. To lose this ally was not a setback, it was a catastrophic amputation that left the English body politic bleeding out. So why would Philip, after nearly 2 decades of steadfast partnership with England, suddenly abandon them? The simplistic answer points to the English failure to support his siege of Compiègne or their perceived role in the death of his father, John the Fearless, years earlier. While these were powerful personal grievances, the real reasons were far more pragmatic and self-serving. Philip was first and foremost a Burgundian nationalist, not a French or English patriot. His sole ambition was to expand his territories and secure maximum autonomy for his duchy. By 1435, he had come to a cold-eyed calculation. The English were a losing bet. Their momentum had stalled after the death of Henry V, and they were now led by a child king, Henry VI, whose regents were divided and ineffective. Throwing his lot in with a fading power no longer served Burgundy's interests. Meanwhile, the French king, Charles VII, offered Philip everything he truly wanted. The negotiations at Arras were not a surrender, they were a hard-nosed business deal. Charles, in a display of stunning diplomatic ruthlessness, agreed to terms that would have been unthinkable for a French king just a generation earlier. He formally absolved Philip of any guilt in the assassination of his own father, a profound personal vindication. More importantly, he granted Burgundy near total independence from the French crown. Philip was released from his obligation of feudal homage, meaning he would no longer have to kneel and swear loyalty to Charles as his overlord. He was given sovereignty over territories he had long coveted, effectively making him a king in all but name. Charles sacrificed a principle, the theoretical unity of his kingdom, to win a devastating practical victory. He bought the loyalty of a traitor by granting him the freedom to be disloyal, all to secure a greater prize, the survival of France itself. The immediate consequences were nothing short of revolutionary for the war's strategic map. Overnight, the English were strategically isolated. Their supply lines through Burgundian territory were severed. The safe haven they had relied on became hostile ground. The wealthy Flemish markets, once open for business, were now closed, choking off the financial lifeblood of the English war effort. Perhaps most critically, it allowed Charles VII to do what no French king had been able to do for decades: focus on a single front. No longer did he have to split his armies and his attention between the English in the north and west and the Burgundians in the east. He could now concentrate his newly reformed professional army, the Compagnies d'Ordonnance, on the methodical reconquest of Normandy and Gascony. The Treaty of Arras didn't just change sides, it changed the entire geometry of the conflict, collapsing a multi-front war into a single, focused campaign of liberation. This single diplomatic act stands as the ultimate testament to the idea that the pen can be mightier than the sword. Charles VII, often overshadowed by more flamboyant warriors like Henry V or Joan of Arc, won his greatest victory not with a charge of knights but with a flourish of a quill. He understood that the deepest loyalties in medieval Europe were not to flags or nations, but to land, title, and personal power. By appealing directly to Philip the Good's ambition, he outmaneuvered the English in a way no army ever could. The Treaty of Arras is the definitive proof that in the long, grueling marathon of the 100 Years' War, the most overlooked turning points were often the quietest ones, where the future of nations was decided not in the roar of battle, but in the whispered promises of a peace treaty. But the most profound legacy of the 100 Years' War lies not in the famous battles or the legendary figures, but in the quiet, bureaucratic revolutions it forced upon the warring kingdoms, innovations in military organization and state finance that would become the very bedrock of the modern world. We often look to later periods for the birth of the professional soldier and the centralized state, but in truth, their origins are deeply rooted in the desperate, century-long struggle between England and France. This prolonged conflict acted as a brutal and efficient laboratory, where the outdated feudal system was systematically dismantled and replaced out of sheer necessity, creating a new blueprint for power that would dominate Europe for centuries to come. Consider the fundamental problem of raising an army. The old feudal model, where a king called upon his nobles to provide knights and soldiers for a limited period of 40 days, was utterly inadequate for a war that spanned generations. You cannot conquer and hold territory with an army that packs up and goes home to bring in the harvest after just a few weeks. England's ingenious solution was the system of indentures. This was essentially a business contract. The crown would sign an agreement or indenture with a powerful captain, often a nobleman or a seasoned knight. This contract specified exactly how many men-at-arms, archers, and other troops the captain would bring, for how long, and for what precise pay. The captain became a military contractor, responsible for recruiting, equipping, and leading his own company. This shifted the burden of recruitment from the crown to private enterprise, creating a more flexible and reliable pool of manpower. These indentured companies were the direct forerunners of the professional regiments of the early modern era. They were standing forces in all but name, available for hire year-round and loyal to the paymaster as much as to the crown. France, learning from its early disastrous defeats, took this concept a revolutionary step further. In 1445, with the English finally on the back foot, King Charles VII issued an ordinance that created the Compagnies d'Ordonnance. This was nothing less than Europe's first permanent, standing army since the height of the Roman Empire. The ordinance established 15 companies, each consisting of 100 lances, a tactical unit that grouped a heavily armored man at arms with several supporting archers and attendants. The key innovation was permanence. These soldiers were not disbanded at the end of a campaign season. They were paid a regular salary by the crown year-round, and they were stationed in garrison towns across France, always ready for action. This created a core of professional, full-time warriors whose entire livelihood depended on the king. It broke the monarchy's centuries-old reliance on the unpredictable and often rebellious feudal levy, transferring military power directly and irrevocably from the nobility to the central state. The very existence of this force was a declaration that the era of private armies and independent dukes was over, and the age of the sovereign state, with a monopoly on violence, had begun. Of course, these revolutionary armies demanded a revolutionary source of funding. You cannot pay thousands of professional soldiers without a massive, reliable, and continuous stream of cash. This fiscal necessity became the mother of state invention. Again, France led the way. The old feudal system of funding wars through occasional grants from the nobility, and the church was haphazard and insufficient. Charles VII made a temporary war tax, the taille, into a permanent annual levy. This direct tax on land and property was collected by royal officials across the kingdom, bypassing the local nobility and flowing directly into the royal treasury. This created a predictable budget that could fund the Compagnies d'Ordonnance indefinitely. It was a monumental shift in the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. The state was no longer funding itself through the personal obligations of a few great lords. It was funding itself by directly taxing the wealth of the entire nation. This established the principle of national taxation for national defense, a cornerstone of every modern state. In England, similar pressures led to the increasing power of Parliament, as the king had to regularly negotiate with the Commons for the funds to fight the war, laying the groundwork for the constitutional monarchies of the future. The impact of these innovations radiated outwards, far beyond the military sphere, to reshape the very nature of governance. A standing army and a permanent tax system required a permanent bureaucracy to manage them. This led to the explosive growth of royal administration departments for finance, for supply, for muster rolls and payrolls. A new class of literate, non-noble officials, lawyers and clerks loyal only to the crown, began to displace the old feudal aristocracy in the business of government. The state was becoming an entity in itself, a complex machine that could operate independently of the personality of the king who happened to be on the throne. This was the true, hidden turning point. The 100 Years' War did not just decide whether England or France would control certain patches of territory. It decided how power itself would be organized. It forged the template of the early modern nation-state, a defined territory ruled by a sovereign authority that maintained a permanent military, funded by a centralized taxation system, and administered by a professional bureaucracy. This model, perfected in the crucible of this epic conflict, would be exported across Europe and eventually the world, setting the stage for the rise of the great powers of the modern era, and forever changing the relationship between the citizen, the army, and the state. And so, as we draw the curtain on this exploration of 20 hidden hinges of history, we are left with a far richer, more complex tapestry than the one we started with. The 100 Years' War emerges not as a simple story of kings and battles, but as a profound and protracted transformation of the Western world itself. It was a brutal century-long workshop where the very ideas of the nation-state, modern finance, and professional warfare were hammered out on the anvil of necessity. The overlooked turning points we've uncovered, from the economic shock of losing Gascony to the bureaucratic revolution of the Winchester Parliament, from the silent, grinding labor of women to the unpredictable fury of the weather, all reveal a fundamental truth. The grand narrative of history is not propelled by a few famous names alone, but by the immense cumulative pressure of countless unseen forces, logistical constraints, social upheavals, technological accidents, and the quiet, desperate choices of ordinary people simply trying to survive. This deeper understanding does more than just fill in the gaps of our historical knowledge. It invites us to look at our own world with a more discerning eye. The conflicts and geopolitical shifts of our own time are rarely as simple as they appear in the headlines. Behind the speeches of leaders and the movement of armies, there are always hidden currents at work: the subtle shifts in global trade, the unintended consequences of technological innovation, the slow-burning social discontent that can suddenly erupt into flame, and the profound, often overlooked impact of environmental change. The story of the 100 Years' War teaches us to look for these deeper rhythms, to question the obvious narrative, and to understand that the true causes of events are often found in the margins, not the center of the story. We hope this journey beyond the textbook has given you a new lens through which to view not only the past but also the present. History is not a closed book of settled facts. It is an ongoing conversation, a detective story where we are constantly uncovering new clues and reassessing the evidence. We would love to continue that conversation with you. What was the most surprising turning point for you? Do you see parallels between these hidden forces of the medieval world and the events shaping our modern era? Share your thoughts and insights in the comments below. Your perspective adds another valuable layer to our collective understanding. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's untold stories, there's plenty more to discover. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video, where we'll be unraveling another fascinating chapter from the past. Give this video a like if you found it informative, and explore our other content for more journeys into the secrets and complexities that have shaped our world. Thank you for watching, and remember, the most powerful stories are often the ones waiting just beneath